It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. The month of May is usually a happy time for Star Wars fans, but then previous Mays have not been preceded by such contentious incidents. In terms of film and television, Jon Favreau's The Mandalorian was the most beloved recent property to come out of Disney Star Wars, with the first 2 seasons received with great acclaim. Then Kathleen Kennedy decided to take over the series from Favreau and, well...
Everything I touch dies!
Now, before anyone starts typing any angry comments, I'll concede that you're right. This isn't an entirely just comparison. After all, it's a comparison that implies that Kathleen Kennedy has ever felt anything resembling shame or remorse in her entire life. Meanwhile, in the realm of video games, Respawn's Jedi Fallen Order was well received enough by people that they actually forgot, temporarily, that Respawn is a developer under thrall to that most bloated and vile and despised edifice to avarice that is Electronic Arts. And it took the sequel having an initial release so buggy that it was compared to Cyberpunk 2077 to finally remind people that technically this is an EA game.
You can't keep getting away with it!
Well, if gamers are going to keep demonstrating over and over again with their spending that they indeed have the short-term memory of an iguana on bath salts, yes they can. All I can do is just stand on the sidelines and shake my head pityingly, especially at the poor fools who pre-ordered Survivor. Even a filthy casual like me understands enough about the modern gaming industry to recognize that pre-ordering a video game in this day and age is like living for revenge. And in the immortal words of David Xanatos, revenge is a sucker's game. But enough preamble. The year was 2011, over a year after the conclusion of Knights of the Old Republic, the comic. However, it seems in between the release of parts 2 and 3 of the Knight Errant series, John Jackson Miller decided to squeeze in one last adventure with his hapless hero, Zane Carrick. While it seems he was able to retain Benjamin Carré to do the cover art, and Dave Wilkins for the occasional variant cover, it seems he wasn't able to bring back his interior artist Brian Ching, instead settling for Italian artist Andrea Muti to do the interiors. His only other contribution to Star Wars being providing the art for a comic book tie-in to Miller's ebook series, The Lost Tribe of the Sith. Apart from that, unlike its predecessor, I've been unable to find any production details regarding the creation of Knights of the Old Republic War. And with that, there's really nothing else to do but begin the story proper. It's been about a year since the conclusion of the main events of the KOTOR comic series. The Mandalorian Wars rage on, with Revan and his Jedi, Mercy Corps backing up the Republic's forces. With the Jedi on their side, the Republic is actually starting to turn the tide against the Mandalorians. Before the intervention of the Revankists, a little world like Essien, recently captured by the Mandalorians, would be effectively lost to the Republic, as their regular troops just have no chance against Mandalorian warriors. With the Jedi, there's actually a solid chance of taking it back. And so our story begins with the attempt to retake Essien, and we find that our hapless hero Zane Carrick's luck is just as bad as ever, as he's been effectively drafted into the Republic Army. His family had recently moved back to Theoda from Dantooine, and he'd gone to visit them, only to be picked up by a recruitment drive. Technically, he was a citizen of that planet just like the rest of his family, he was of age, and he wasn't a Jedi. As you may recall, he turned down the offer to be brought back into the Order after Vindication. And so, on that technicality, Zane was forced into a war that he really had no desire to fight. To make matters even worse, he's been placed under the command of Dallin Morvis, whom you may vaguely recall as Admiral Saul Karath's chief lackey from the main comic series. As a Republic officer, Morvis is defined by three characteristics: a lack of imagination, a slavish obedience to orders, and as someone who witnessed Mandalore the Ultimate's bombardment of Sirocco and its civilian population back in Days of Fear, a burning hatred of the Mandalorians. He's been ordered to take the beaches surrounding the Mandalorian encampment at a place called Mount Savage, and he is going to do just that. And if the Mandalorians are fleeing from that beachhead, he has absolutely no compunction against firing on them as they flee. When Zane protests firing on an enemy that has clearly lost the will to fight, Morvis retorts that this is payback for everything the Mandalorians have done during the war. They showed no mercy, neither will I. And while Miller is very clearly painting Morvis as the heel in this setup, his perspective is not an entirely unreasonable one. First of all, the Mandalorians are clearly the aggressors in the war. They started it, and no one denies that. Second, besides conquering multiple worlds, they've also effectively either enslaved their local populations to support the war effort, or force conscripted said populations to fight their fight for them. Third, you not only have the mass killing of civilians on Sirocco, but the attempted genocide of the entire Cathar race. Something that Cassis Fett carried out with Mandalore the Ultimate's approval. Say what you will about the Republic at this point in history, but they never did anything nearly as bad in the course of the Mandalorian War. And before anyone brings up the mass shadow generator, let me point out the following for the record. 1. Revan had that constructed on his own initiative, and as far as I've been able to find, no one in the Republic was aware of it until Malachor V. Second, none of the casualties at Malachor V were civilian. The only thing that's really objectionable about what happened there was that Revan sacrificed an inordinate number of men and women on his own side, Jedi and Republic troopers alike, in the process of destroying Mandalore's fleet. At any rate, Zane remains the idealistic good boy that he always was. And of course, as is also typical, he is not rewarded for it. After a Mandalorian warrior crashes her Basilisk war droid into Morvis's command skiff, Zane actually helps her escape safely when he notices that she has a child with her. Of course, she just punches him for his mercy, and then Morvis has him punched for helping the enemy. But being a former fugitive hunted across the galaxy has given Zane Carrick something of a spine. He experienced firsthand exactly what happens when people take it into their heads that they have the authority to decide on who lives or dies. Zane is certainly self-aware enough to know that he doesn't have that right, and he certainly isn't going to let Morvis make that call either. The argument is interrupted by a group of Jedi who actually volunteered for this war effort, led by a former member of the High Council named Dorjander Case. He reports that the Mandalorians have gone to ground in the forests surrounding Mount Savage. All they need to do is winkle them out. Morvis suggests that they use explosives to burn the forest down and thus flush out the Mandalorians, and Case seems to go along with this. Of course, Zane, being the idealistic goody two-shoes that he is, isn't having any of it, and he actually runs off to try and warn the Mandalorians of the incoming Holocaust. Morvis and the Republic troops catch up to him, only to find that there's no Mandalorians there. Well, unless you count their empty suits of armor set up as dummies.
It's a trap!
And just like that, Morvis's detachment is overwhelmed by a surprise attack of Mandalorians on Basilisk war droids. The ground troops are decimated, the ship Reciprocity that took them to Hessian in the first place is taken, and the survivors, including Zane and Morvis, are taken prisoner by Dorjander Case. Turns out the Jedi isn't just a turncoat, he's gone native. Chapter 1 opened with Zane being forced to fight for the Republic. Chapter 2 opens like a bizarre mirror image of Chapter 1, with Zane being forced to fight for the other side. The kid really does have no luck. If anything, his new Mandalorian superior, a rally master named Krake, is even more brutal than Morvis was. The Togorian actually slaps Zane aside when he tries to help him up after an explosion. And it really does drive home the ruthless nature of the Mandalorian ethos. They offer no compassion or mercy to the enemy because they expect none for themselves. It really is Herbert Spencer's survival of the fittest taken to its logical conclusion. If you're a Mandalorian, you fight, and either you conquer or you die. In the case of the latter, it means that you were either too weak or too stupid to live, and the Mandalorians are well rid of you. If anything, the only person having a worse day than Zane is Captain Morvis, who gets chewed out by the Rally Master for refusing to fire on Republic forces. Morvis's attempt to protest only results in Krake reminding his two conscripts that the Mandalorians don't take prisoners, they use them. Like all the others, they were given one of two choices: be a slave or be a soldier. At any rate, the Mandalorians do successfully take the Republic base on Halthor, in large part thanks to the help of Case and his Mandalorian Knights. Case has fully embraced the Mandalorian way of life, and believes that by bringing him and his fellow Jedi on side, he is evening the odds in the struggle against a Republic that he denounces as corrupt. Case's view seems to be the minority, however, as most of the Mandalorians resent the idea of working alongside Jedi. They only do so because Mandalore the Ultimate commanded it. Mandalore the Ultimate was always a leader willing to adopt unconventional means of obtaining victory. Cassus Fett and Demagol are good examples of that. But the way most Mandalorians see it, like Krake or Ko Sornel, the woman that Zane rescued back on Essien, they would rather win or lose the war with blaster and blade, not sorcery. Speaking of Ko, despite the fact that she punched Zane earlier on Essien, she does feel a slight debt of honor to him for helping her and her child escape danger. And so, because she spoke up for him during the taking of Halthor, Krake gives Zane and Morvis into her care. As far as he's concerned, these two troublesome conscripts are her problem now. And so, Zane and Morvis end up eating dinner that night with the Sornel family: Ko, her husband Harm, and their 3 children. And no, despite some first impressions, this is not a mixed-race family. Devaronians are the rare example of an alien race in Star Wars and sci-fi in general that actually exhibit sexual dimorphism. Males have the horns, females have the hair. The Sornels are reserved and distant, as one might expect with Mandalorians dealing with outsiders. But Zane has always been good at making friends, and eventually they warm up to him enough that he's able to persuade Ko, a comm officer, to send a message for him, as long as he assures her that it's not to anyone in the Republic, it's to a civilian. Zane is able to recognize the humanity of the Sornels, well, humanity for lack of a better term anyway, but Morvis still views them as nothing but his captors, and in fact tries to kill them in their sleep that night. Only by luck and some strenuous persuasion on Zane's part does the jackass avoid getting a blaster to the skull. He is, however, sent off to the slave pens. Shortly afterwards, Case arrives to have a word with Zane. The renegade Jedi has now recollected exactly who Zane used to be, the falsely accused runaway Padawan. A Padawan who, by luck or the Force, has managed to find his way out of many a tight spot. So now, he's got a proposition for our hero, because it turns out the next Mandalorian target is Feada, Zane's home and where his family currently lives. What the Mandalorians really want are the comm stations in orbit around the planet, but obviously they would need to control the planet as well. Case is fully prepared to subject Feada to a full-scale planetary invasion unless Zane can come up with an alternative. Luckily, Zane more than lives up to his reputation. The Mandalorians only need the comm stations surrounding the planet, and they only need it for a few days according to Case. So Zane cooks up a deception where the reciprocity comes in, claiming that its crew needs medical treatment from a new Mandalorian bioweapon. Of course, Feada's planetary authorities aren't going to let the ship land and possibly spread the infection, but Case's clout as a Jedi Master, no one else in the Republic knows he's turned coat, is enough to get them to send reciprocity to the comm station, because it has a medical facility and a quarantine area. Of course, this is what the Mandalorians are after all along. They plan to hijack the station for a few days and then depart with the Republic none the wiser. The whole point of this plan, Zane's plan I must remind you, is to make sure that no one dies. Unfortunately, Mandalorians are very much a proud warrior race and they do not like sneaking about. Once Reciprocity has docked with the station, the plan was to have Zane and several Mandalorian warriors sealed in biocapsules be brought aboard the station. The biocapsule containing Zane was to have an accidental failure, thus potentially exposing the crew of the station to the plague, at which point the crew would go into quarantine, allowing the Mandalorians to take over the station. Unfortunately, things go wrong very quickly, as is typical with Zane and his plans. The station staff insist on evacuating the station, which would mean warning Feda of what's going on, and before Case can mind trick them into going into quarantine, the impatient Mandalorians bust out of their own capsules and start shooting. So, alas, Zane wasn't able to save every single life involved. Still, only a dozen station crew dead is practically a bloodless victory by Mandalorian standards. Case very quickly finds whatever information he was looking for at the comm station, and sends Kra'ake back with this information to Halthor, where several Dreadnought chiefs, essentially Mandalorian ship captains, are standing ready to act on whatever information Case has uncovered. Not the best day for Zane Carrick. Luckily, there is a silver lining to this cloud. That message he persuaded Ko to send to the Republic, Civilian, got through, and he's even got a reply. Who could he possibly want to contact at a time like this? Who else but Marn Hieroglyph, decorated war hero, respectable businessman, criminal mastermind. We even get a brief cameo of LB and Slisk. Anyway, Zane contacted Griff because while the Snivian has gone mostly legit, he still has ways and means of getting information that legitimate channels might not have allowed. And what Zane wanted was information on Dorjander Case. And Griff has found plenty of it in the Republic Ministry of Defense files. And so the comic cuts to Zane confronting Case, both with the full knowledge of who the former Jedi is, and with what his ultimate plan is. Like Zane, Case had been captured by the Mandalorians before, but his capture had been 20 years ago during the Sith War. He returned to the Republic after the war was lost for the Mandalorians, and he eventually gained a seat on the High Council, where he became one of the most vocal opponents of the Jedi Order, joining the Mandalorian Wars on the Republic's side. The Republic, if you recall, was losing the Mandalorian Wars early on, and they desperately wanted Jedi support. So, according to Zane, they found some way of removing Case from his position on the Council. A vacancy that would be filled, thanks to the machinations of Hazen back in Vindication, by Lucian Dre, Zane's old master. Granted, Lucian was also opposed to involvement in the Mandalorian Wars, as he believed the Sith was the greater threat. So again, Hazen's manipulations make for the only possible explanation as to why he got to be the one to fill Case's seat. As to what Case's plan is, by taking Essien, Halthor, and now the comm stations at Feda, he's given the Mandalorians a direct route to Dantooine, specifically the Jedi Academy on Dantooine. Case's plan is to kidnap the younglings undergoing training there and make them into a new generation of Mandalorian knights. Naturally, Zane objects to the idea of kidnapping the younglings so that they can essentially be made into child soldiers, but Case remains unmoved. He shows Zane an image of Varda, a Mandalorian woman he fell in love with during his time with them. She was apparently pregnant with their first child when she was killed by a Republic bombing raid led by a Jedi. Her death was one of the big reasons why Case chose to betray the Republic in the end. Apparently, he believed there was a certain injustice in her manner of dying, that she wasn't killed in a fair fight. He concedes that the Mandalorians have their own fallibilities and foibles, but he thinks the Republic is worse and, more importantly, unlikely to change for the better. With the example of his Mandalorian knights, he believes that the Mandalorians might be more amenable to change for the better. He's also convinced that Mandalorian victory in this war is inevitable, even with the Revankists joining the Republic war effort. But that without his Mandalorian knights, the war will drag on that much longer. It's here that I have to stop the story and point out that Case's logic is completely out to lunch. Even if we can sympathize with him grieving the loss of his lover, his reasoning is off by a country mile. He says that the Mandalorians might be more open to change than the Republic, but as we've clearly seen with characters like Krake, most Mandalorians only tolerate Case and his knights because Mandalore the Ultimate says so. Much like the forces of Khorne in Warhammer 40k, they view the Jedi and the use of their force powers as magic and therefore dishonorable cheating. I somehow have a hard time believing that they would welcome the idea of Case and his fellow knights introducing Jedi values into the Mandalorian culture, particularly any values that go against their veneration of strength and their desire for conquest. Second, his belief that the Mandalorians would win in spite of Jedi involvement on the Republic's side would be proven wrong by subsequent events. Everyone agrees in universe that it was Jedi intervention in the war, and especially under Revan's brilliant and charismatic leadership, that turned the tide in favor of the Republic. Creating Mandalorian Jedi to counter the Republic would not end the war more quickly. If anything, it would make it more likely that the war would drag on. Having Force sensitives on one side and none on the other is a big advantage to the side that has them. The Mandalorian Knights would nullify that advantage. Anyway, Case leaves Zane under the watchful eye of Ko Sornell once again. But as it turns out, Ko is actually sympathetic to Zane on this one. In that weird quixotic way that Mandalorian honor works, she's perfectly fine with taking in children that the Mandalorians have orphaned in their wars, but kidnapping them directly from their parents is beyond the pale. Still, Mandalore himself has ordered that she and the other Mandalorians follow Case, and whatever debt of honor she owes to Zane for what he did on Essien, she isn't willing to sabotage the plan for him. Luckily, Zane thinks quick and he's able to convince Ko to adopt a compromise. She has to do nothing more than let him escape under the provision that he will not send word of warning to Dantooine. This way he can technically gain the freedom he needs to try and stop Case, but without directly sabotaging the Mandalorian attack on Dantooine. And so Zane stows away aboard Kraake's shuttle heading back to Halthor, where 3 Mandalorian dreadnoughts and their crews are waiting to move on Dantooine. His first stop on arrival is to the slave pens, where the Republic prisoners are held, including Captain Morvis. The Republic prisoners have been trying to escape on their own, but Zane arrives with an offer of an alternative. He'll help them escape if they help him steal a ship. The ultimate plan is to hijack one of the 3 Mandalorian dreadnoughts ready to move on Case's order. With stealth, a little luck, and the old Jedi mind trick, Zane manages to acquire the tools he needs to take it. Enough suits of Mandalorian Neo-Crusader armor to disguise the Republic prisoners, and for some strange reason, a tub of the utterly repulsive slop they've been feeding the prisoners. The disguised prisoners manage to snag themselves a shuttle, at which point a petulant Captain Morvis decides to have a hissy fit, mostly because he just can't conceive of how Zane's plan can work. How can barely 100 prisoners hijack a dreadnought with a 10,000-man crew? How can they possibly succeed, especially given Zane's famously bad luck, which Morvis in part blames for both Ziroko and the Vangervalis incident over Coruscant? Zane can only respond to this ridiculousness by giving Morvis the chewing out he's had a long time in coming. Morvis came from a fairly privileged background. This has been mentioned previously in the story in passing. His mother is a Republic senator, his father is the head of an incredibly financially successful firm. Like so many officers of his background, Morvis took what he had for granted, never giving any thought to the consequences of his actions, precisely because he could rely on family connections to avoid them. In that sense, Morvis is similar to Lucien Dre, Zane's old master, who tried to have him killed and branded the former Padawan a murderer. Unlike Lucien, Morvis's subordinates follow him not because they believe in his cause, but because they have no choice. Quote, "That would make me stop and think, but not you. You still line them up and throw them into the furnace. Look at them. They're tired and scared and hungry and they need a leader. Well, it's too bad for them, because Dallin Morvis only plays a leader." It turns out this may well have been the dose of humble pie the doctor ordered. Morvis admits to Zane that after the Vangervalis incident back in Vindication, his was very much a fall from grace, in spite of his family connections. It was only through the influence of his old commander Karat that he got command of the Reciprocity. And by now, the good admiral has washed his hands of his former subordinate. His command on Essian was his last chance. Every member of his family had done some great service for the Republic. It was one of the reasons why he joined the Navy in the first place. Now he feels that it's all over. There's nothing left and nowhere for him to go. To which Zane replies with another line that I have to quote because, again, Miller is just that good. Morvis, Captain, you don't set out to be a hero. You just do what you have to do when you have to do it. I know what it's like to be down to one last chance, but to take the chance, you've got to stay in the game. And so, at last, the two men reach a kind of reconciliation with one another. For a change, Zane's plan runs pretty much as expected. He and his disguised Republic troops make it to the bridge to confront the field marshal in charge of the vessel, and then, using that foul-smelling slop they were feeding the prisoners, pretends an outbreak of Jedi brain fever, terrifying the Mandalorians into evacuating the ship to avoid the sickness. And just like that, the Mandalorian dreadnought Parjai, Victory, is theirs, and they make way for Dantooine before the other two can react. Meanwhile, Dorjander Case and the Reciprocity are being escorted to Dantooine by the Republic Defense Force, because after all, they still think he's on their side. Ko Sornell, who at the last minute took over as comms officer for the Reciprocity, receives word of the brain fever outbreak on the Parjai, but neglects to mention this to Case, saying only that Dreadnought support is on the way. With that, Case, his Mandalorian Knights, and his reluctant Mandalorian regulars launch their kidnapping raid on the Jedi Academy. The Jedi instructors, led by Master Jar from KOTOR the video game, put up a fight at first, but then the Mandalorian dreadnought Parjai arrives in orbit, and it's a choice between orbital bombardment or surrender. The Masters are tied up inside the Academy itself, while Case rounds up the remaining younglings and prepares to induct them into his new order. Of course, the Parjai was the dreadnought hijacked by Zane and company, so of course they emerge in Mandalorian uniform, preparing to take the younglings off Case's hands. Case is confused as the agreement was that the younglings would remain with him and his Mandalorian Knights. A disguised Zane informs him that Mandalore the Ultimate has other plans, and he's the guy in charge. And in fact, Mandalore has assigned a new mission to Case, his Knights, and the Reciprocity. They almost get away with it too, but earlier in the conversation, Case mentioned the idea of scuttling the Reciprocity as he felt he had no more use for it. And a disguised Morvis, Navy officer to the core, can't help but flinch visibly at the idea of destroying his ship. And then, at the end of that conversation, Case catches the captain out, and their cover is blown. The other Mandalorian Knights block any access to the shuttle, and Case forces the other disguised Republic troops to unmask by threatening to kill Morvis and Zane. It would seem our hero's run of good luck has run out yet again. But as Zane informs Case, he always knows that a bad break is coming with his plans, and because he knows it's coming, he can prepare for it. So saying, he activates a detonator, and the rigged shuttle explodes, because of course it was rigged. Taken by surprise and caught between the Republic troops and the shuttle, Case, his Knights, and the real Mandalorians are knocked out or gravely injured, giving Zane and the others the opportunity to snatch the younglings and get them to the Reciprocity. Case was farther away from the shuttle explosion, so he recovers first and takes off in his jetpack, forcing Zane to intervene, and they end up crashing through the ceiling of the Jedi Academy, déjà vu, and fighting a lightsaber duel in front of the bound and restrained Jedi Masters. Of course, Case is stronger and far more experienced, so it's not much of a contest. Case is about to take off again and take another shot at the Reciprocity when Ko steps in to inform him that the situation has changed. The report of the Jedi brain fever outbreak has spread among the clans, and the Mandalorian leaders have decided that messing with Jedi things is more trouble than it's worth. Whatever Mandalore himself thinks, the clans would rather win the war without Jedi magic. The Mandalorian Knight project has been unofficially but decisively scuppered. At first, Case refuses to accept defeat, threatening to kill both Zane and Ko if they get in his way. But it turns out Ko is pregnant with her and Harm's fourth child. An uncomfortable reminder of Varda, Case's lover, and how she died at the hands of a Jedi. And Case is not so far gone that he's willing to cross that particular line. He submits to being arrested by the Jedi Masters on condition that the remaining Mandalorians on Dantooine be allowed to leave without hindrance. In the end, Case is put on show trial by the Republic, which may have been a mistake on their part as he uses it to espouse his cause. Not that it really gets him anywhere, the Republic's citizenry hate him for his betrayal. As for Morvis, when the Mandalorians left Dantooine, they left behind the Parjai, making it effectively a prize of war. And so at last, Morvis finally gets that accomplishment he was hoping to achieve, with Zane's help, and even gets a medal for it. For his part, Zane is just happy to finally be able to go home to his family and Jarail on Feida. Still, recent events have persuaded him that if he wants his family to remain safe, the war has to end sooner rather than later, and maybe he can do something about it. And so, the former conscript volunteers for Republic service. At the suggestion of Captain Morvis no less, Zane becomes Lieutenant Zane Carrick, diplomatic agent attached to the Reciprocity. Essentially, he's there to be the captain's moral compass. As Morvis himself put it, people always expected too much of him and nothing from Zane. Together, they balance out. As ever, Zane is unsure of whether he can truly live up to this new responsibility, but as a certain mastermind once told him, if you don't know how to be someone, you can fake it. Knights of the Old Republic War is a solid story. Of course, the greatest strength is still Miller's writing. While Andrea Mutti's art is pretty decent, not the best, I still think Brian Ching was the best artist Miller ever worked with, but I would put him at least on par with Dustin Weaver. Really, my biggest gripe with this comic is the relative absence of the other characters from the main series. Griff and Jarail only appear very briefly, and it makes you realize how a lot of the appeal of the main series was having that essential trio of Zane, Griff, and Jarail and having their personalities work off one another. Here in War, the principal secondary characters are Ko, who becomes a reluctant ally of Zane and provides an insight into the world of the Mandalorians beyond the fighting. Morvis, who serves initially as an antagonistic foil to Zane on the Republic side, but does turn over a new leaf at the end. And the technical villain of the piece, Dorjander Case. Of the three, Case I think is the most interesting. In the hands of a lesser writer, this character would likely be arcing towards the dark side. But Miller handles this character exceptionally well, as always. And so despite his antagonist role and the fact that what he ultimately plans is wrong, Case never comes off as evil, just very, very misguided. It's a kind of antagonist you don't really see often in Star Wars. For all their, quote, good intentions, the Covenant always came off with a villainous aura to them. Not so here. I guess my only real criticism of the story of War is the fact that Morvis's heel face turn in the third act is a little abrupt. Other than that, he works well as the aforementioned foil to Zane, and the sort of odd couple-esque friendship they start to form at the end gives the story a nice hopeful note to end on. The Mandalorian Wars are far from over, but there is the chance that things might change for the better. For this and all the other reasons I've just mentioned, I am willing to give Knights of the Old Republic War a canon verdict. As a sequel/spin-off that didn't really need to exist, it serves its purpose admirably, and while not a grand finish like Demon was in the main series, it's not a bad note for the adventures of Zane Carrick to go out on. Okay, enough comics. Next up, I give my thoughts on the thing you've all been waiting for since I first announced the KOTOR special. And I discuss the thing that everyone actually thinks about when they hear the name Knights of the Old Republic. Until then.